Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing really well and welcome back to another part of this flamingo tutorial where we're going to be continuing on with those feathers that make up the wing. So we've done most of it now. We've just got this like lower right hand side section to do, but it's quite big. It's like pretty much the full size of my hand, if not a bit more. So I think I'm going to cut it down into two separate parts. So I'm going to do this section for the next part and then just leave this little bit for the last part. And then we can decide whether or not to do a bit of a background or not. So I think this is going to be part 7. So yeah, I've literally filmed this bit and this bit in the past few days, so I feel like I'm just on a roll with it now. So what I'm going to do is, as usual, just rub out some of these initial outlines just so we can't see them underneath our drawing, just to make the lines a little bit fainter. So I think I'm going to draw up to this feather here. Obviously it's quite difficult to see when you've not mapped in that colour as to which bit that actually is. But somewhere around here I'm going to finish for part 7. So as usual, I'm going to start with the pan pastels, and I'm going to start first with the permanent red tint, which is the palest pink that I have. And I'm going to use my soft knife oval sponge to apply it. Now, like I did with the previous part, I'm just going to get a scrap piece of paper and sort of smudge off any excess pigment that's on there. Like that, so it's pretty much clean now. So then you want to dab the permanent red tint pigment on the back of your sponge, and then just tap off the excess and begin to start mapping in those main colours and sort of shapes really within the section that we're going to be drawing. So I would start by just going along some of those initial outlines, just to help you kind of visualise where those main feathers are. And then from there you can start to kind of fill in some of those shadowy areas. And you can reapply that pigment as many times as you want. Although a little bit does go a long way, and you know, it does kind of spread around really easily. So I am being quite delicate when I'm adding this pan pastel. You can, in a sense, be a little bit loose because you can fill in certain areas quite quick with it being, you know, pan pastel, and it's easily spreadable. Sounds like I'm talking about butter, easily spreadable. But yeah, you can, it's just a really quick way to get that first initial base layer in there. And like I've shown you in previous parts, like it speeds up the whole process so much. And it just helps you like really visualize everything. So I'm just gonna use this rubber again just to erase these lines up here as well. So I'm not going to apply any more pigment in terms of dabbing it on the back of my sponge, but I'm just going to use what's left to kind of fill in the paler areas of the feathers and almost do like small circular motions to get that even coverage throughout. Just so it's got a bit of a base layer and it's not completely white. Over the top of that, I'm going to go in with the pearlescent red, which is slightly darker, and literally do the same thing. So dab it on the back of my sponge, tap off the excess, and then apply that to those like darkest, most pigmented, saturated parts of the feathers, where that colour is quite bright. It definitely helps applying it to like the edges as well, the outer edges of your sponge, because when you're working up to some of these initial outlines, you can be a lot more precise and accurate. And then with the excess that's on the sponge, just with what's left, just fill in a little bit more of those paler parts of the feathers. So we're still adding a bit of a base, but it's a lot more subtle. I might just add a little bit of the magenta tint, which I didn't use in the previous part because it was very, very pink, whereas we're sort of progressing into those more blue toned feathers. So we do have those like slight lilac-y areas. So this is the magenta tint, unfortunately the one that's smashed to smithereens. So again, just dab a little bit of that in the back of your sponge, tap off any excess, and I'm just going to apply this to where those like shadowy areas are within the feathers, just to add like a subtle purpley lilac tint. I'm trying not to get carried away and kind of fill in more of those feathers on the right hand side. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave that there with the magenta tint. So it's not obvious, but there's just like little like lilac-y tints, mainly in the shadowy areas where the feathers are kind of overlapping, like in and amongst all those pink tones that we've got so far. So I'm going to leave that there, and now use the shade Orange just to make some of those pinks look a bit more kind of coral coloured. So we've got this gorgeous colour here that we want to sort of replicate but make even more vibrant throughout these feathers. So I'm just going to start applying like a light layer of this shade Orange over the top of the most like vibrant, rich parts of the feathers, and just sort of blend that in with those pink colours underneath. And it should blend in really nicely. I think I mentioned in the previous part as well that pan pastels, because they're so like, they're such a thin layer, they're basically transparent, you can sort of mix pigments together really easily. I tend to do this literally on the paper, so if you've added like a light layer of this orange, you could then go back in with like your pearlescent red, and just use a little bit of that over the top, which should blend really nicely with that orange underneath to create like that coral salmon colour. And then back in with the orange. To be honest, that's probably the main orangey part of what we're going to be drawing for part 7. I can't believe we're on part 7. I keep forgetting which part we're on because we've done quite a few now. And I'm just using what's left on the back of my sponge to add like a really subtle orangey tint to other parts of the feathers. So I'm going to leave that there with the pan pastels and now work into the feathers with coloured pencils. So I've picked out the pink white, which is the one that I always tend to start with, just to add like another bit of a base layer to mainly the palest part of the feathers. I think I'm just going to get that scrap piece of paper again and just fold it over. And just put it underneath my hand so I'm not kind of smudging anything. I'm going to start with this one on the left. Once you've kind of been shading with it for, you know, a few seconds, it does start to wear down on one side and you do end up with a really flat surface on one side of your pencil. And that's the side that you want to keep shading with because it'll give you a much softer line. You'll be able to shade in the area a lot quicker. And yeah, I always just like using luminance pencils as my first sort of base layer. Some of you have made some really nice progress on this tutorial, so thank you so much for working through it with me. Like I said in the previous part, this has probably been one of the most challenging tutorials that I've ever filmed, to be honest, probably because it's so big and because it's using loads of colours that we're not used to using, and the fact there's just so much going on in terms of these feathers. So it has been quite a challenge, but I think at the end it will look really good in terms of, you know, all that detail. It's just the wing in particular is so intricate with all of these feathers that are overlapping. So hopefully it will end up really good, especially if we end up adding a little background as well. I know that the background in the reference photo is like bright blue, and I am tempted to do a little bit of one, maybe not as vibrant as it is in the reference photo, but something just a little bit more subtle but still get that blue element in there, just because I think it'll make all these pinky orangey colours really pop off the page, because oranges and blues, like, they make each other stand out. So I think maybe it might be a good idea to add a little bit of a background, but maybe I'll leave that as like an optional part right at the end. So if you want to add a background and be brave, then you can do, and if you want to just leave it as it is, then that's absolutely fine as well. But we'll see. I might change my mind until then. We'll see. I'm just going to add a little bit into this quill at the bottom. I'm using like a medium pressure as well when I'm shading with this pink white. You know, you don't need to go in with a light pressure because it won't really show up that well. I mean, it's very subtle anyway, you can hardly see it, but in terms of what it feels like to draw on top of this layer, you want to be able to feel that sort of creamy, like waxy base. If you're too light pressured with it, you know, you won't be able to really tell that you've got a layer on top of that pan pastel. I've got this little mark on the paper here that I'm not really sure. I don't know if I dropped something on the paper when I started drawing the outline, like very, very early on. But even with an eraser, it's not coming off. So I'm hoping that as we keep adding more and more layers, it's just going to make that little mark a bit more subtle, to a point where we can hardly see it at all. That's what I'm hoping anyway. It's just so annoying that it's literally in the place of the feather that's the most pale. Like this part of the feather's almost white, and then we've got this little like dark patch that's just come out of nowhere. But I just thought I'd mention that because, you know, you might be faced with something similar in future drawings or a commission and stuff, and I'm trying to think of any other times where I've sort of disrupted the paper surface and just had to keep working with it. I can't really remember. Sometimes, I mean, Fabriano paper, touch wood, I buy the big sheets of it, and to be honest, I've never really had it where it's had like imperfections in the paper or disruptions on the surface. It's always been like pretty much perfect. Well, it has been perfect. There's not really been anything wrong with it, but this is definitely my fault, wherever this has come from. I think I have dropped something on it when I was doing the outline. I seem to vaguely remember. But yeah, we'll see how it sort of gets on, and hopefully we can make it look a bit more faint. I think I'd have a lot more accidents with like commissions and in terms of paper and stuff like that if I worked flat on my desk, because I've always got a brew next to me or a cup of tea or something, and I'm the most clumsy person ever. Like, I'm always dropping my pencils more on the floor than there is on the desk, literally. But I think if I worked flat on the desk, it would be a lot more risky. I'd probably end up with like little splashes or something on it and have to start again. Whereas because I work at an angle on my drawing board, it kind of keeps it out of the way from all stuff like that. So, yeah, I probably need it for that more than anything else. So that's just added a really nice sort of waxy, creamy base layer on top of that pan pastel, and it's also sort of locked in the pan pastel as well. We've like really pushed it into those grooves within the paper, and obviously with the colour pencil over the top of it, it's kind of trapped between the two, so it's not really going to smudge, especially with the more layers that we add. Just going to finish off this little bit down here. Next up, I'm going to go in with the shade Salmon, which is much more of like a corally sort of colour. And you just want to add this to those most vibrant, rich areas of the feathers, and also, you know, just use it to kind of define some of the edges, start neatening up the shape of the feathers and adding in those like frayed edges by flicking back up towards the feather, like I'm doing here. Even with that, I'm still using like the really blunt side of my pencil to get that softer line. I'm using it with a much lighter pressure for those more like subtle areas of pink within these paler feathers. I'm really hoping this pencil lasts until the end of the drawing as well, because I keep sharpening it and it keeps getting smaller and smaller. It's literally like a stub. Next up I'm going to go in with the Herculaneum red, which is like a pinky, corally, like flesh colour. And just add like a light layer, just kind of build that up into some areas of the feathers. It's more of like a peachy tone. And you'll probably find at this stage that it is starting to pick up quite a lot of that grainy texture, which is completely normal at this stage. With each layer it will get kind of squashed down and become a lot smoother. So I'm using it to slightly darken some of these shadows, just to give the illusion that some of these feathers are overlapping others, creating these shadows kind of underneath them. And with these shadows, you kind of want to fade it off into the next feather sort of underneath, so release your pressure as you bring your shading out a little bit further. Next up I'm going to go in with the shade Scarlet, which is that really vibrant, rich red colour. And you want to start by applying it in those like darkest shadowy areas of the feathers. So kind of like where they're overlapping. And I am using quite a light pressure. The bit on the lower right hand side is very, very rich red, but I'm going to leave that for the last part as we kind of curve round and bring it down to the bottom. next up I'm going to go in with the shade Coral, which is a Faber-Castell pencil. If you've got the polychromo, then use that. I'm just going to use the watercolour pencil because I don't have the polychromo, as I've mentioned in other parts. And yeah, you just want to keep building up some of this tonal value around like the shadowy areas of the feathers, using it with a light pressure into more of the paler parts, just to keep building up that colour really. This is kind of like a good colour just to bring everything together as a bit of a mid-tone. It's not too vibrant, but it's also not too pale or dull. It's just like a nice in-between pencil. I'm using it with a slightly harder pressure for this section, just to kind of squash down some of that tooth of the paper. I'm going to just briefly go in with the burnt sienna 50% and just add a little bit into those darker shadowy areas. Like these sort of creases down the feather along the bottom right hand side. Just a tiny little bit just along this quill. So to start smoothing out some of this grainy texture, you want to go back in with the pink white luminance pencil and use it with a slightly harder pressure than we did before, just to really push that pigment into the grooves of the paper and really start to squash down that tooth and like spread that pigment around, really blend it into each other so those colours all sort of merge together nicely. Almost use this to kind of flick down into some of those like little frayed edges and elongated parts of the feather. Just going to use this over this vibrant section of the feathers with a slightly lighter pressure because I don't want to desaturate those colours underneath too much, but I think it is really important to get that softness, and we can always, you know, go back in with those colours over the top. I'm doing like small circular motions using the bluntest part of my pencil just to, you know, kind of move around those colours underneath and just blend. So you can see the difference between like these two feathers and this down here compared with what we've not sort of blended out yet. It's just so much softer. This is always the step that starts to kind of really ache your hand because you're really working that pigment into the paper, pressing down quite hard. So that's made such a huge difference. You know, all those feathers are now looking really, really smooth, really blended, slightly out of focus as well, which means that, you know, this complicated part that we drew in part 5, so these feathers that are all very close together and almost like tiered or layered, the focus remains on that section of the wing. As the feathers kind of sprawl out a bit more and they get, you know, slightly more separated and bigger as well, they are slightly out of focus. So yeah, I'm quite happy with that blended, slightly out of focus outcome that I've managed to achieve using the pink white luminance pencil, and just literally with a hard pressure sort of gone over everything. So at this point I want to go back in with some of my more vibrant colours just to bring that kind of richness and vibrancy back up to the surface now that we've sort of squashed everything down and it's all looking completely smooth. Sometimes when you use like a pale colour to blend over the top of what you've got down already, it does tend to desaturate it a little bit. So just to make sure those colours are really vibrant, especially like in this area here and the feathers that are kind of behind these pale ones, I'm going to start by going in with the salmon again. And yeah, just basically work that over the top with a like medium to hard pressure. You can kind of judge how like hard or light to press down, depending on how well it shows up in terms of like your pressure. Make sure your quills are nice and sort of straight all the way down. It's very easy to kind of make them look a little bit bumpy or skew whiff when, you know, you're shading around that area. So just make sure the edges are really neat. I'm going to add a little bit more of the burnt sienna 50% into those darkest areas. Sort of like underneath some of the feathers of the wing, where it's really quite dark amongst those shadows. I think I'm just going to go over that briefly with the shade Scarlet, which is that really vibrant red. And then I'm just going to use the salmon again to kind of blend that out a little bit. You'll find that luminance pencils always create a bit more of that grainy texture because they're so waxy and they're kind of like a thicker layer. Whereas the polychromos being a lot harder and being predominantly oil based, they're good for sort of those final details and just, you know, reducing these last little bits of grainy texture that the luminance pencils have sort of picked up. So I'm just using this just to kind of blend out those areas really. Add a tiny bit of orange, just a very light layer into those more like most orangey areas of the feathers. just to kind of tint that colour. Almost using it as like a bit of a glaze over the top. Like I'm literally just letting it kind of brush across the surface. I'm going to go in next with the craft knife slice tool, and to be honest it's not as detailed as like over here with all these feathers, because those feathers are kind of more out of focus, but just down this particular feather, just along the edge, just going to do a few like little wispy lines, kind of flicking, just to give that sort of feathery frayed texture. Kind of working along some of the lines that we've already got there so far and kind of elongating them slightly and flicking. So I'd probably say that's it in terms of the craft knife slice tool. All those edges are very sort of soft and blurry, so we can't see loads of really defined lines. So I'm probably going to leave that there with the craft knife slice tool and switch to the white Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle pencil, just for some of those softer little lines. You can also use this to kind of brighten up areas as well. I think I'm just going to use it to go over this little section that still hasn't been covered completely, this little mark that I spoke about right at the start. It's definitely a lot more subtle, but it is still there if you look closely. If ever you've got anything like that you do want to cover, you know, you don't have to perfectly stick to what's going on in the reference photo. I could add another little quill or another line just over the top, which I think I might do actually, just to try and cover it a little bit more. So if I go in with the shade Coral and just add like a very subtle light pressured little line over the top. I mean, there's that much going on with the feathers anyway. It's kind of difficult to see which one's which to start off with, so another little line isn't going to make too much of a difference, but it is in terms of covering this little mark. And then might go over that with the shade Salmon. And then use the pink white luminance pencil to just sort of blend that out a little bit. And you can still like just about see it, but it's far more hidden now, which is a lot better. Obviously, hopefully you won't have any little marks like that on your paper. But yeah, I think I'm probably going to leave that there for part 6. I feel like that was, again, a lot more simple than the previous part and the part before that, because these feathers are so like, they're so much bigger, they're a lot paler, and it's more just about blending and just building up those colours and having them all merged together nicely. Those are the main sort of techniques we've been using. And colour-wise, I've pretty much used the same colours now for the past sort of 2 or 3 parts. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll be back very, very shortly with the final part, where we'll just be literally finishing off these feathers in the wing. A lot more of those blue feathers as well, which will be nice. And then we can decide if we want to draw in a little bit of a background or not. So yeah, thank you for watching, and as usual, I've left the line drawing the materials list and the reference photo in the video description below. If you've got any questions at all, then do let me know, and keep tagging me in all of your works in progress because they literally look insane. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll be back very soon.